My name is Kim Lemke, and together with György Hetényi, we present the thermal variability of the lower continental crust. This study comprises a new and comprehensive data set of key thermal properties of lower crustal lithologies and point to their variability. This study was conducted in the frame of the drilling project DIVE, which aims to understand the evolution and the shaping processes of the lower continental crust. And therefore, our presentation is twofold today. And György will give us an overview about the outcome of phase 1 of DIVE, and I will continue then with the thermal part. Please.
Greetings to everyone. Thank you for joining. Kim will manage the slides remotely, and you can go to the next one, please. So you may ask why we are interested in the lower continental crusts, and arguably the lower crust is the layer of the Earth which is the least known to the community. Why we can say that? The upper crust is quite well exposed. We have a good number of samples around the Earth and good archives of the rocks. The mantle, we have much less rocks, but homogeneous in composition, so there's not much variability in the mantle. In between, in the lower crust, there is very little exposure and limited amount of samples available. We cannot drill directly into the in-situ lower crust either, and whatever comes out in outcrops or xantholites could be biased in the sampling. On the other hand, the lower crust is probably chemically still heterogeneous, and this is something that is not fully mapped in the community of petrology and beyond. The other problem with the lower crust is that people who are interested in that, you typically apply two different scales of investigations. Geologists and petrologists typically come from the smaller scale, specimen investigation scales, while with geophysics, we usually have a crude scale, kilometer or larger investigation scales. And so the two are at a mismatch in most of the lower crustal studies. Next one, please. So if you imagine yourself on this scale, next, we are somewhere in the middle. Okay, this is the logarithmic scale between kilometers and micrometers. Next one, please. And the geologists typically use small scale in the lab and let's say mesoscale or medium scale in the outcrops. And they try to extrapolate to larger scale interpretations, including the crust and the lithospheric scales. On the other hand, geophysicists, next one, please, typically start with field investigations using either passive or active seismics or maybe gravimetry or other methods. But to calibrate those methods, they need measurements of rocks' physical properties. And this is again happening at a much smaller scale. So there's a gap in between the field and the lab investigations. So that's why we still have a number of open questions on the lower crust. Next one, please. And among these, the ones that are interesting for our project in general, the drilling project DIVE, regard different questions such as the composition and the evolution of the lower crust, how the heat-producing elements are distributed, what is the carbon cycle in the lower crust, what are the other physical properties, especially their variability in the rocks of the lower crust, what is the deformation style, the rheology of this layer, can we actually find microbial life at depths, and ultimately, what is the bottom of the crust? How do you define crust to mantle or moho transition? That's something that is still could be investigated. Next one, please. To answer these questions, we set up a collaborative large drilling project. Our rig was much smaller than this one. Next one. It was actually a quite handsome rig, and with that rig, we could bridge the gap between the geological outcrop and the laboratory scales. And with the borehole geophysics that has been performed inside the hole, we could bridge the gap between the geophysical techniques. Next one, please. So this project, which is called DIVE, Drilling the Ivrea Verbano Zone, is actually located in this particular location. Ivrea and Verbano are two villages or two cities in the Western Alps. In the geological map showing you the Western Alps, there's a brown, dark brown sliver of rocks in the middle of the map, next, which is the green box. And if you zoom into that green box, what you find is a series of rocks that are exposing the full crustal section from upper crustal sediments to lower crustal rocks and even some peridotite. This is due to tilting of the ancient crustal column to a position which is favorable to basically walk across the layers. The red layers are surface volcanics, and if you walk to the north, west, and the west direction in the Central Valley in that area, you are crossing deeper and deeper rocks of the crust. Two particular metasediments or metapelite layers are known in this area. One is called kinzigite, which is an amphibolite facies sediment. The other is called stronolite, which is a granulite facies metasediment with two different shades of yellow. And besides these rocks, you also find diorites, norites, gabbros, metamafics, and some ultramafic rocks as well, and some small amount of marbles and quartzites. Next one, please. This is the cross-section in a vertical cross-section in the area, which shows how the crust was tilted to bring these rocks up to the surface. And we also have very good geophysical evidence for that. Next one, please. If you look at the 3D gravimetry map or model of the area, you find rocks that are very, very close to the surface. Dense rocks, mantle density rocks, which is 1 to 2 kilometer depth below the surface. So it seems like really this whole sliver of Adriatic lower lithosphere was brought towards the surface in the alpine collision. The big value of choosing this area is that this sequence is very little overprinted from alpine deformation, so we can study the original structure of the lower crust before alpine collision. Next one. So I spare you the details of how the drilling project was put together. I go directly to tell you that we have been successful in drilling 2 boreholes. The first one, called 1B, is a former middle crustal section, almost reached 600 meters depth. And the second is the lowermost crust drilling, called 1A, and this is slightly exceeded 900 meters of depth. Both holes were fully cored, so we have almost 1.5 kilometers of drill cores available for analysis. Of course, our scientists have started with that, but the cores will be available very soon in a couple of months for further research. Next one. One of the most striking results in the boreholes is the big spatial variability of lithologies. This is my favorite rock core. In 1 meter of core, you find 4 different lithologies, one after the other, and even within that, you see a very fine scale layering. Next. There has been also some other nice rocks, for example, this calcsilicate in the lower part of the screen. Next. On the right-hand side, we find some nice garnets in gabbro embedded in the lower crust. On the left-hand side, you see 2 successive generations of pseudotachylite, so basically traces of former earthquakes causing partial melt. Next. And if you scan through the archive of rocks, you see a lot of different deformation patterns that actually triggered us to make a memory game to train us in recognizing these patterns in a playful way. Next one. This big variability of lithologies is also very well visible on the lithological log of the 2 holes. On the left hand, you have the middle crustal section. On the right-hand side, you have the lower crustal section. You have the percentage-wise distribution of the various lithologies. And what is striking is that all these stripes that you see in the lithological logs show the very strong interlayering of the cores in both boreholes. Next one. The key findings based on the lithological analysis is that in the middle and lower crust, we do find a lot of metasediments, actually more than what we expected at these steps, especially in the middle crust. About 40% of the 1 meter cores had more than 1 lithology included, so there is significant interlayering. In the second hole, so 1A on the right, there's ample quantity of pseudotachylite, so these partially molten seismic rocks. And what we did also statistically is to look at the layer thicknesses, and we found that there are many thin and less few, and actually very few thick layers. So if you do a distribution of layer thicknesses, it's sort of a hyperbolic distribution with a lot of thin and very small amount of thick layers. And this will be important in various analyses, including today's presentations. We have a lot of photos, we have a lot of borehole logs, core scans, so there's a very rich data set, which I will not detail today, but just for you to know that the database is quite broad and will be available for use as well. Next one. If you're interested in knowing more about the drilling itself and what has been analyzed in the field, I invite you to look at the operational report, which has been published 2 months ago. At the provided link, you can have access to this full document. Beyond that, a number of publications have come out or are in press in our project. Next one. And to give you an overview, very briefly, there is a large amount of projects ongoing, about 40 projects covering various aspects of earth sciences, various types of pictures on the right you can see. It's really bringing us very interesting details of the middle and lower continental crust. And today in particular, because this is the heat flow day, you will hear from Kim Lemke how these rocks behave with respect to heat and temperature changes, and she will present you the thermal characterization of the lower continental crust.
Thank you very much. I continue with the thermal variability of the lower continental crust. And when we have a look into the literature, we find that the data on thermal properties like thermal conductivity, thermal diffusivity, and radiogenic heat production of lower crustal rocks are scarce. But we very well know that those properties are crucial for any thermal investigation, for example, when modeling the conductive or transient heat flow in the crust or lithosphere. Due to this data gap, there are existing models which simplify the thermal structure by using, for example, average values for the radiogenic heat production or for thermal conductivity for the different crustal section, with which they calculate, for example, the surface heat flow or the temperatures. And due to these averages, the calculations can be prone to error. And we want to improve the existing data sets and expand them by obtaining more thermal properties of the lower continental crust. This is one goal of the study. Another point is that many existing data, especially for thermal conductivity, may not fully cover the whole spatial and lithological range of this thermal property. And this can, because they use point-wise measurements, and this can be improved, for example, by continuous high-resolution thermal conductivity profiles on rock samples, which is another focus of this study to fully capture these variabilities. We performed these high-resolution thermal conductivity and thermal diffusivity profiles by measuring half cores, the dive half cores. One example you can see here on the left-hand side by using the optical scanning method and a resolution of 2 millimeters. We measured a total length of 33 meters and obtained so more than 13,000 data points per property. We also measured thermal conductivity by the needle probe technique for drill core hole rounds and for surface samples, which we have collected in the close-by area of the 2 boreholes. We wanted to obtain the minimum and maximum thermal conductivity to calculate the anisotropy of these rocks. And also, in the case of the surface samples, we used the optical scanning method to compare these 2 methods with each other. And we have done those measurements together with colleagues from the Montana University of Leoben and with a colleague from Zurich. A brief description of the measurements performed with the optical thermal conductivity scanner, which you can see in this bottom picture here. Here, this is the scanning unit of the scanner, which is moving below the standard in the sample and measuring the temperature before heating with the cold sensor, then heating the sample and measuring the temperature after heating the sample. And so, because we know the thermal conductivity of the standards, the program can calculate the thermal conductivity of the sample by comparing the temperature differences of the standard and the sample. We performed these scannings along the core axis under ambient conditions and on dry samples. Here I would like to emphasize that the rocks are very low in porosity, and usually the porosity is below 1%. I want to show you 3 examples of those high resolution scans. You can see very well that many rock features are nicely resolved by the scanner. For example, in graph A, you see a pseudotachylite, which has a much higher thermoconductivity compared to the host rock. In graph B, you see the transition from the metasediment to another lithology with a higher thermoconductivity. In that case, it is a quartzite. And in graph C, you see mineral grains which have a much higher thermoconductivity compared to the rock. In that case, it is quartz. This graph gives you an overview about the 13,000 measurement points performed on the half course with the OTCS. You see them in the box plot sorted after their lithologies, and the colors refer to the different lithologies we found in the 2 boreholes, which are again displayed on the right-hand side. 50% of the data are within the box, and 99.3% of the data are within the whiskers. Everything below and above is an outlier. What we can see here is that thermoconductivity is very variable within a certain lithology, but also between the different lithologies. And in general, on average, the thermoconductivity of the metasediments of borehole 1B and also the stronalites, the granulite facies metasediments of borehole 1E, is larger compared to the mafic lithologies, for instance, the different gabbrotypes and garnet granulites and the amphibolite. And this is due to the different thermoconductivities of the rock-forming minerals of these lithologies. And we have seen that the metasediments show a very large chemical range. We also see that the thermoconductivity in the different lithologies show a Gaussian distribution, and I would like to point out here that this width of this Gaussian distribution can be different and is usually larger for the metasediments and more narrow for the mafic lithologies. When we zoom into the histogram of the amphibolite facies metasediments, we can see the results of the measurements performed with the needle probe technique, perpendicular and parallel to the foliation. And one symbol at the same height are the measurements of one sample, which is indicated by the yellow bar here. First, we see that all the measurements performed with the needle probe technique are within the same range of the measurements performed with the optical scanning methods. And we could calculate also the anisotropy, which ranges between 1.06 to 1.42 for all samples we have measured. The radiogenic heat production we determined by using this equation here from the density log of the drill cores of the 2 boreholes that has been done with an MSCL multi-sensor core logger, and the concentrations of the heat-producing elements, uranium, thorium, and potassium. Here we use 2 different techniques. First, from bulk rock analysis, my colleague here at the University of Lausanne, Alexia Secretin, she performed bulk rock analysis based on rock powders, which she fused to disk and measured then with the laser ICP-MS and XRF. And I use rock powders, which I measured with a gamma spectrometer. And so we could measure a total number of 288 samples. These are the results of the heat-producing element in our rocks. You can see that those concentrations are in general very low, and they decrease from the more felsic lithologies towards the mafic, ultramafic lithologies. And we put these concentrations on a log-log scale to display better the very low concentrations. Consequently, the calculated radiogenic heat production decreases also for the felsic lithologies towards the mafic ultramafic lithologies. And what we also see here on this graph is that the radiogenic heat production decreases with increasing density. You can see here that this cloud of mafic rocks is a bit below this trend. And this is because these lithologies are very variable in their chemistry. We calculated the radiogenic heat production for borehole 1B, which is the metasedimentary section, and this average of 1.26 microwatt per cubic meter is a lithological weighted average and is significantly higher compared to the average calculated for the mafic borehole, which is 0.1 microwatt per cubic meter. And so we can say that the metasediments significantly contribute to the lower crustal heat budget. Now we could determine the variability of thermal properties on different scales and can now assess the variability of thermal properties across all the observed scales of our samples and borehole. We range here from the anisotropy of a few centimeters to the interborehole scale of tens of kilometers. We express those variabilities by the variability factors, which we calculated by different ratios, which are here for the different scales. And you can see that in the case for thermoconductivity, thermodiffusivity, and radiogenic heat production, the variability increases with increasing scale. And these factors can be over 4 in the case of thermoconductivity, and in the case of the radiogenic heat production, this can be larger than 10. Now, we have seen that the lower continental crust shows a large variability in thermal properties, but also in the layer structure. And we want to use this new database and evidence we get from the different studies to conduct a new 1D heat flow model. We are calculating in this model the geotherm, for instance, in downward direction with an input surface heat flow and surface temperature to obtain the MOHO temperature and MOHO heat flow. And what we want to change here to previous models is that we want to use the new database and step away from the simplification of the thermal and layer structure and define several layers of this crustal section by our new thermal property dataset. We want to use a combination of different model types, parameter distributions, chemical composition, and layering, and we want to determine what the impact of a single variable parameter, thermoconductivity, radiogenic heat production, and the characteristic thickness of internal layering, how this impacts the temperature and heat flow and their uncertainties. And this is the first result. You see here the uncertainties of the temperature and the uncertainties of the heat flow versus the layer thickness. And the gray bar through each data point shows the layer thickness ranges for each model calculation. And we see that thermoconductivity shows the largest impact on the temperature uncertainties, and in the case of the heat flow, the radiogenic heat production shows the largest impact. The calculated uncertainties of temperature and heat flow are comparable to temperature and heat flow corrections usually done for terrain effects like paleoclimate, sedimentation, erosion, and so on. And now, on the last slide, I want to show you that our data are available from, or the full data are available from June 2026, when the ICDP moratorium is ending, and this is available on the GFZ data service. You see here the two related publications to our study. I thank you very much.